I am still skeptical about meditating Ronald McDonald images, such as we see here, which I believe comes from a McDonald's in Nepal. Buddha bikinis, Buddha bongs, Buddha candles, Zen cosmetics. Has Buddhism become a brand, as some in the fashion world suggest? Is the Buddha, as one ad put it recently, what's sexy now?
I will be honest with you and tell you that my prejudice is, as far as I can see, that the postmodern media crazy world seems to me to be really deranged and quite out of scale. Nevertheless, somehow, out of this blizzard, what's worthwhile and true will emerge.
I think this is the real question we confront is not only what is a Buddhist media or Buddhist film or Buddhist novel, whatever it might be, but what really is a Buddhist?
One of my favorite philosophers is Ludwig Wittgenstein, who is famous for saying, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." People thought that Wittgenstein meant by this that it was no use thinking about or talking about or wondering about that which we can't speak about. But in fact, he meant exactly the opposite of that. He meant that the unspeakable was the most salient reality. It's just that it was unspeakable. I'm a Zen Buddhist priest and teacher. I practiced for many, many years at the San Francisco Zen Center, where I was abbot from 1995 to 2000. And in 2000, I started a small organization of my own called the Everyday Zen Foundation, which is for the purpose of spreading Zen teachings in various kinds of ways in the world so that I can have fun and meet all kinds of different people. I would define Buddhism as anything that, with a broad-minded feeling and an open heart, tries to understand reality, tries to understand truth. And I don't mean social truth or economic truth, but particularly religious truth, spiritual truth. The mystical is not how the world is, it's that the world is. So I think Wittgenstein's a great example of somebody who I would say has a tremendous Buddhist feeling to his work, because he is broad-minded, open-minded, and open-hearted, and he is trying to understand, truth about, spiritual truth about our lives. And he's been, I think, a lot misunderstood, because people think that he was saying we should ignore those things that we can't speak about. But I think he was saying the opposite. I think he was saying the things that we can't speak about are, in fact, precisely the most important things. Let's just be clear about the difference between what we can speak about and what is too intimate to be spoken about. When he says that the mystical is not how the world is, but that it is, to me that points to the deepest kind of mysticism. Being present with the world as it actually is mystical life.
Unfortunately, I think we're seeing an example today of what the anthropologists call the pizza effect, where something starts, let's say, like pizza does in Italy. It travels to New York or Chicago, takes a very different form, perhaps improves in some ways, perhaps not in some ways, is re-imported back to its home country of Italy and is then sold in Italy as pizza, totally transformed from what it was when it first began. I think we see something of the same thing also in some of the Asian movies about Buddhism, where they picked up on the ways in which Westerners have often portrayed Buddhists or kind of Asian religious types of different varieties as being kind of aloof and apathetic. And this has sort of been introduced back into Asian cinema, but through the guise of the West then. So this is what I would call kind of a pizza effect in the cinema also.
There was, in 1993, an entire issue of Vogue magazine. Excuse me? What month of 93? December to January, the 1992-1993 issue of Vogue magazine. It should be a collector's item. It was guest edited by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We've heard that clothes make the man. Here, the tagline is, when the habit makes the monk. And you can't make this stuff up. Right. And what we see startlingly is that the monks, in their orangeness, have morphed into pillows on the bottom. So this is, monks, or at least the essence, the orangeness of monks, perhaps that's the content within that interests fashion designers, have now found a utility that is also aesthetically pleasing.
I'd like to suggest that visual culture is a continuum, and that you might think of ads like the ones we've seen as being one end, and maybe popular culture somewhere in the middle. And there's also an esoteric visual culture. And if you can think of the continuum as a horizon, there is a place where they meet, and that's the point at which I'm going to try to be working today. This image of an ad for the iPod Shuffle, Life is Random, was reproduced with a recent New York Times article about using Buddhist concepts to sell products. In this case, to sell a music player that serves up in random order the music that you have entered into it. But there is another concept this ad is selling. The concept of consumers as potential artists of life. That idea that your mind is completely open to experience is something that I think that iPod Shuffle ad is actually pushing in a subtle way. And so you create the aesthetic experience in your own mind. So the point I was making is you have this rather esoteric high art concept colliding with an ad that's drawing on not only the Taoist Buddhist concept, life is change, life is random, but also the idea that every person makes of their own lives a work of art, and the iPod Shuffle is one phase of that. And the point I was making is that the concept of life as a work of art, well, in the first place, it's a concept that comes out of D.T. Suzuki, who wrote an introduction to the English version of Zen and the Art of Archery, the Harago book, where he talks about, for the accomplished practitioner, your body is your brush and your life is your canvas. And so he talks literally about life as a work of art.
I think in some ways teaching in universities performed something of the same role that the scholar monks in Buddhist universities used to hold. They were the ones who kind of were the maintainers of the tradition, the scholarly tradition of the religion, those who were transmitting it on to the next generation. And in some ways we serve something of that same role, I think, in contemporary Western Buddhism. One of my colleagues teaches a course on Zen Buddhism, and the first day he always asked him, what is Zen? And it's amazing the range of answers you get, often guided by what they see in the media. I mean, they're bombarded with the notion of Zen, actually. And even more so than Buddhism per se, I think Zen really has sort of captured the imagination of Americans. So there's a lot of disabusing of preconceptions, I think. It's a bias that has a very long pedigree that Buddhism is somehow negative, it's aloof, apathetic, uninterested in social welfare, social realities, solely devoted to one's personal, internal, introspective life. So we have to teach our students what the full range of Buddhist practice entails and what the full range of Buddhist perspectives can really mean in vivifying one's life.
I started a consortium project called Awake, Art, Buddhism, and the Dimensions of Consciousness was the name of this project, bringing together 50 institutional people, artists, curators, museum educators, museum administrators, a couple of people from performing arts centers. And we considered the various aspects of the influence of Buddhism on contemporary art. And over 50 programs came out of it, exhibitions, Buddhist International Film Festival, and this book that we'll talk about. Toshi Lee, the Taiwanese historian who wrote the essay for this book, he had done his dissertation on Marcel Duchamp in Buddhism, and we commissioned an essay from him. And his position is that Duchamp's alter ego, Rose C'est la Vie, was actually a manifestation of the Bodhisattva Guanyin, the Bodhisattva of compassion. And he uses as an example this poster that Duchamp did for an exhibition at the end of his life, where his hand is in the fear not mudra of Avalokiteshvara or Guanyin in Chinese, the Bodhisattva of compassion, and this, being a lotus. It's pretty clear once you see it. I've done myself further work on him for another book I have coming out in July called Smile of the Buddha. There's an essay on Duchamp in that also, and I look at him more through Tibetan Tantric Buddhism, which is very interesting if you think of the eroticism in Duchamp's work. I think it's very helpful to, again, look at Duchamp's work through the lens of Tibetan Tantra.
Then, for those interested in health, an entire essay on the master of all physicians, the Buddha, his self, yes? Including very nice depictions of the birth of a being according to the Tibetan traditions. So for Tibetophiles, the graphics are very nice. And then there is a spread on reincarnation under the title, again curiously in English, reincarnation, yes, Lamas Forever.
I had the opportunity once to interview the Dalai Lama, and anyone who's seen the Dalai Lama knows that there's a spontaneity and a joy. There's no bullshit, I mean, he's what you see is it's real. It's alive. It's his presence. I mean, I think even the word isn't kundun. I think it means presence or something. So anyway, I had this. I thought it was a great interview, and there's all this wisdom and wonderful man. And I got back to the office and I looked in my notebook and it wasn't there. I mean, it's not the words, it's the feeling, and so to portray that in writing is difficult. Not just Buddhism, but spirituality as opposed to religion. I mean, religion are institutions that make news. They have meetings. They take positions on things. They're political, on abortion or the war, things like that. Whereas with spirituality, it's so vague and ephemeral. It's hard to get a hold of and to explain to someone who doesn't really hasn't experienced it. Because it's experiential, it's harder to convey to someone else by its nature. I did a search in our computer, and it's very easy now. You punch in the word Buddha or Buddhism to see how many times it's been mentioned in a chronicle story. And I found that from 1990 to 1995, I forget the exact figures, but it was about 250 stories in that 5-year period. From 95 to 2000, more or less the same, about 250. And from 2000 to 2005, there were more than 500 stories. It's been kind of an underground, or sort of a quiet revolution in some ways, and it's, I think the mainstream media is starting to pick up on it more now.
Toward the end of his life, Marcel Duchamp told an interviewer, quote, "If you wish, my art would be that of living. Each second, each breath is a work which is inscribed nowhere, which is neither visual nor cerebral. It's a sort of constant euphoria," unquote. Duchamp's very first conceptual work was Bicycle Wheel, which he made, he said, for his own use. Duchamp was clear that Bicycle Wheel was originally created not as an art object, but as an object of meditation. When you think about Duchamp and the idea of art being in the perceiver, obviously you can be making art at any time. I mean, I can be looking at you and experiencing you aesthetically if I'm open in the correct way. The meditating mind and the creative mind, whether it's making or perceiving, seem to be the same mind. It seems to be happening in the same place. Somebody's going to do, you know, one of these brain scans, and I hope prove that correct. But that's my sense of it.
One of the things about Zen practice is that in Zen practice there's always been an emphasis on our need to express our practice. We all have to express our practice. If someone was given to writing songs, given to making films, if they would do it that way, if they would say, oh, this is not to make money, this is not to impress people, this is not even to make a point, this is to express my practice, to express my understanding. It's a vehicle for my development as a spiritual practitioner. I think if people would approach art in that way, I think art and craft have a tremendous potential to be spiritually infused. And I'm a great believer in the power of our intentions and the sincerity of our hearts, that if you had that intention and you really carried it out, that your product would communicate to someone.
why it is that Buddhism does get portrayed so much in the American media. I mean, considering the numbers, there have been quite a lot of articles, movies, books about Buddhism. And I have 4 reasons I think for that. One is that Buddhism is exotic. It's still exotic, and we love the exotic. It takes us out of our normal, mundane lives. And you have someone like the Dalai Lama from Tibet. I mean, what is a more mystical place than Shangri-La in Tibet? So there's a lot of appeal, just the exotica of Buddhism. Another reason is it's an experiential faith. It's based on people's experience. And so there's a real power there in Buddhism that just makes for great stories of how it changes people's lives. Of course, all religions do, but especially Buddhism. The third would be that it's ethnic. There's the immigrant Buddhists from all around the world, mostly Asia, of course. And then there are the so-called white Buddhists or converts, people from the 60s and 70s and beyond who converted to Buddhism. But here in the Bay Area in San Francisco, we have a very large Chinese population and lots of immigrants from Vietnam, all over Asia. So it's a way for the paper to cover different ethnic communities, which we're trying to do more. Fourth one, they all start with E. It's eclectic. It mixes with other faiths. Because it's not really doctrinal, people can really practice Buddhism and still consider themselves Catholic or Jewish. There's no real conflict there. And you find that a lot of the people who are into Buddhism in California really wouldn't call themselves Buddhist, but they're very serious about their Buddhist meditation.
This happy monk, made in China but distributed by a company in Seattle, is a child's squeaky toy. However, this is clearly a product for adults. But this happy monk is not just for, but rather is about adults. He is equipped with the attributes of modern interconnectivity and a high-stress life, coffee and a cell phone. In other words, the antithesis, perhaps, of the enlightened Buddha or monastic monk or nun.
In popular culture, we know very well that the word samsara is a perfume by Guerlain. Nirvana is the name of a now defunct Seattle grunge band. I chose not to dwell on the fact that the lead singer committed suicide, which we might say is the existential opposite of achieving nirvana, though it is an extinction of sorts. I mentioned that perhaps one of the best-known purveyors of the Mahayana message of the life of the Bodhisattva is in an album that went, as we say, double platinum, meaning sold 2 million copies, by the Beastie Boys, called Ill Communication, in a cut called Bodhisattva, in which the message of the great 8th century Indian Buddhist master Shantideva is told in a vernacular that kids can relate to. Two young, sort of giddy young ladies who had tattoos, and they said, well, it's Tibetan, I'm told, something about friendship, and the Tibetan was Gewe Shinyan, Kalyana Mitra, that is spiritual friend, being a friend. And so they were branded with this sort of Mahayana message of befriending all who live, unconsciously, as it were. There are other tropes, however. We find in the sports world, Tibetan tattoo on a National Basketball Association star, I believe Iverson. It says on his shoulder, top, which means power, mach, yeah? And it suggests that you too can be powerful. It's disjoined from what normally is considered Buddhism, but the fact that it's Tibetan does evoke the mysterious, exotic, and perhaps transformative promise.
The media, by its nature, will always be depicting something, and so as long as Buddhism is out there, it will find itself needing to depict Buddhism. And those depictions, in my view, will by their nature always be incorrect. Despite the great influence of the various media on all of us, I have a lot of faith that the Buddhism that I'm interested in, the unspeakable, intimate Buddhism, will persist and will be carried on through the various traditions quietly. If, as I believe, the various Western Buddhist traditions we have inherited from Asia will go on quietly outside of the media glare, they will not go on unchanged. Every practitioner effects a change in a tradition. If I were giving advice to a good person in the media, I would say probably neither you nor I is smart enough to figure out what to do and how to make the media maximize its potential for good. But it's a big responsibility to be someone who makes media. And so if I were someone who knew that my work would be seen or heard by many, many people and would have an effect on many people, I would say to myself, I better tend to my spiritual practice.
In some sense, what non-attachment allows you to do is to determine and to really see what true responsibility is. I think often we may have a vision from our own independent personal point of view of what we really ought to be doing. But that point of view may be so limited that we can't really see what the true responsibility would be in a certain situation. And so what that non-attachment allows you to do is to have a more expansive perspective from which you can really see much more clearly, and hopefully see more clearly with wisdom, what the appropriate response really ought to be in a certain situation.
But I don't think it's the kind of thing that we can sit around together and think it through and say, oh, no, I know, if I made a film like this, this would happen. Nobody knows, what happens from our activity. So we cultivate our practice, I think, and we cultivate our intentions, and then we do the best we can with some faith. So that's what I would say. Practice yourself and practice as much as you can, and consider it a part of your responsibility as a person who does media, that you need to do that.
Wilt u dvd's bestellen van onze programma's? Bel dan 040 282 0022. Wilt u meer weten over onze uitzendingen? Vraag dan nu de gratis programmagids aan. Bel 035 629 3191 of kijk op www.boeddhistischeomroep.nl.